Hi, my name is Irvine Kirsch. I'm professor of psychology currently at the University of Hull, before that at the University of Plymouth, and before that at the University of Connecticut.
To begin with, could you tell me how you were first introduced to hypnosis?
Yeah, first introduction to hypnosis was as a kid, and reading a book written for the lay public, how to hypnotize people and things like that. I think I was something like 14 years old, 15 years old. Melvin Powers was the author. And so that was just a curious phenomenon. Forgot all about it. Then I went into psychology, went to graduate school, and at graduate school I was at the University of Southern California. And one of the faculty members, one of the professors in the clinical psychology program there was Perry London. Perry London had done a lot of research in hypnosis. If you look at the classic methodologies of hypnosis by Sheehan and Perry, what you'll see is a whole section, a whole chapter on the London Führer design, London being Perry London from the University of Southern California. And I learned hypnosis clinically from him as part of the clinical psychology practicum. So now I had something that I could use clinically, but didn't think of doing any research on it. Didn't do a lot of thinking about it from a theoretical point of view until I was a professor at the University of Connecticut. I had a student there by the name of Jim Counsell. And one of the things I used to do with my research team there was to suggest to them that they go to the literature, find a couple of related, interesting articles, bring them in, and let's, as an exercise, see if we could use that as a basis to design some research studies. Jim brought in a couple of articles on hypnosis. We discussed it, and in the research team designed a couple of research studies based on it. And one of the things we started looking at in these research designs was the role of expectancy in hypnosis, because that has always been a major interest of mine. What is the role of expectancy in anything? So this was a new area in which to look at it. This became a master's thesis for Jim and another master's thesis for another student that we worked on, and Jim's got published in in JPSP, that one, or in Journal of Consulting and Clinical, I think, that one, and then later his dissertation in JPSP, which was an offshoot of that. And that got me interested and hooked on hypnosis, and so I began doing a good amount of research in the area.
Could you share your own understanding or definition of hypnosis?
Well, let's start with definition. There are different kinds of definitions. There are ideal definitions where you try and say, what is this thing supposed to be about? But then when you are doing something scientifically, you have to have an operational definition as well. How are you going to operationalize it? Operationally, hypnosis has been the use of an induction, but then the question becomes, what constitutes an induction? That's a big, horny issue. Induction seems to have as its bottom common denominator to all the various inductions of hypnosis information provided to the subject that this is some procedure that's designed to put them into an altered state, to put them into a different state of consciousness that culturally we call hypnosis. So that seems to be a suggestion to enter a hypnotic situation, enter a hypnotic condition. That's in its most narrow sense. In the broadest sense, this is another legitimate way to look at it. You can think about what Hilgard used to call the domain of hypnosis, which is this general set of characteristic phenomenon that includes such things centrally as an induction of hypnosis and responding to particular kinds of suggestions to experience something differently than you know the external world to be, such as, there's nothing making your hand lighter, there are no balloons attached to your hand, but the suggestion is your hand's going to feel light, your arm's going to go up anyway. So those are suggestions. From that broader perspective, a domain of hypnosis includes not only the possible, presumed, hypothesized hypnotic state, but also responses to imaginative suggestions given outside of hypnosis. So you have this broad definition, you have a narrow definition. They're both legitimate definitions of hypnosis. The important thing is not to confuse them, because what can happen is you can get into a logical mishmash if in one half a sentence your implicit definition of hypnosis is operational and therefore more narrow, and in another it's broader. In terms of the domain of hypnosis, there's little debate. These are phenomena. In terms of the more specific definition, what is an altered state, that's where you start having sharp theoretical differences.
Could you comment about the whole altered state versus non-altered state and the new information coming out from the fMRIs and things like that, of where that puts us now in our current evolution of hypnosis?
Sure. The fallback view, received view, so to speak, was that hypnosis was an altered state of consciousness, a trance state, and the initial view, as perhaps most clearly expressed by William James more than 100 years ago now, was that there's this background state of consciousness that is a prerequisite, a necessity, if you're going to respond to suggestions, that you can't respond to suggestions without, as a prerequisite, being in this altered state of consciousness. Data made that a difficult position to maintain once people started doing research, starting in particular with Clark Hull's laboratory in the late 1920s, where Hull over and over again found that people who could respond to suggestion in or out of hypnosis, and he therefore reconceptualized the hypnotic state as being something that enhances responsiveness to suggestion. That was a general conception then of hypnosis among academics until the late 1950s. And now you enter the era where you have two challenges to that, Barber and Sarbin, and where they start looking at this relatively small enhancement that you get when you do a hypnotic induction, and the question becomes, well, why are you getting that enhancement? Is this really evidence of a hypnotic state? That's what the hypnotic state doing? Or maybe we've been wrong all along in thinking that there is a hypnotic state. Maybe this relatively small enhancement in responsiveness to suggestion that you're getting is due to such mundane characteristics as cultural conceptions, the role that you're in when you're cast in the social role of being a hypnotic subject, the motivations that you have, the expectancies that you have about what hypnosis is, what it means, how you might respond to it. And that led to the formal state, non-state debate, followed then by the work of two of Barber's proteges, Nick Spanos and John Chops. And when I started seriously thinking about hypnosis, I read their work, I read Hilgard's work, and I was pretty much convinced by the work of Barber and Sarbin and Spanos and Chops that, at least from the data up until that point, there was no convincing data and no need to postulate an altered state. It was not particularly central to my theoretical concerns more globally outside of hypnosis, when my basic theoretical interest is on the role of what I call response expectancies, as the expectancy for automatic reaction, behavioral and subjective, even more particular to whatever, whether it be hypnosis, whether it be placebo, whether it be anything else. And I could have adapted that to either a state or a non-state conception. Hal Zemansky as a matter of fact, suggested to me, well, you know, maybe there is a hypnotic state, and maybe the role of response expectancies is that's how you get into the hypnotic state. Maybe that's an expectancy-generated phenomenon. Something compelling in that, given that hypnotic inductions seem to be able to consist of anything at all. They're sort of like placebos in that sense. But my reading of the data suggested to me that the non-state position was more parsimonious, and I didn't see any data that were really convincing to suggest that there's an altered state. Now, especially in the sense of an altered state that has any major impact on behavior, that has a causal impact. I also became aware that Killstrom, for example, had developed what I call a nominal state theory, or he called a weak version of the state hypothesis, which is that state doesn't denote anything in particular, that it's not something that can have any impact on behavior, that it's just a kind of a convenient shorthand that we use for all the changes in experience and behavior that you have when you give suggestions or do inductions in this domain of hypnosis. And when you look at an altered state from that perspective, of course there is, as Killstrom says, and I agree with him, there is no dispute. There are no differences. Then you're just talking about linguistic preference, whether you want to use this label state or you don't want to use it. If you don't have something that's actually affecting behavior, my inclination is to not use it because people misunderstand it, they're misled by it. And I'd like to keep the issue clean also because there may be an altered state, a trance state that is produced by we don't know what yet, that facilitates or enables responses to at least some suggestions, some types of suggestions. Neuroimaging, other new methods in neuroscience make possible a new way of investigating that. My colleagues and I at the University of Hull and other places have been engaging in that. We try to be very careful in our methodology. Our last study on it actually provides some nice support, I think, for an altered state hypothesis. It's not conclusive. One study never is. But it's data that I would not have predicted. In fact, I explicitly predicted getting different results. So now that's leading me to start thinking, okay, we've got to follow up on that, and I may need to change my mind. Perhaps I've been wrong for 30 years in my view on the altered state issue. We'll have to see what more data say.
Do you have a favorite story about hypnosis that you could share?
Favorite story about it? No, I have a few stories that I like. Some of you probably, I bet you already have someone talk about the story that I didn't witness. I've only heard secondhand about the debate between Orrin and Ted Sarvin and Ted Barber and Jack Hilgard. But I bet you already have.
I don't have that on tape, so why don't you go ahead and share that?
Okay, but this is secondhand, so I have to caution. I don't know how accurate this is, but I love the story. And to understand the story, what you have to understand is that Ted Barber was a highly responsive, he would be what we call a high hypnotizable, high suggestible. He would score 11 or 12 on the Stanford scale, and people see that as a little inconsistent with the fact that he was a non-state theorist, but his whole point was he can have all of these experiences, and he doesn't have to be in hypnosis to do that. He doesn't have to be in a trance state. It's just something, an ability that he has that he can do. And he was interested in looking at what are the personality characteristics of people like him who could respond to almost any kind of suggestion and have these compelling experiences. Before I tell the story, I'll say that's particularly important because many people misinterpret the non-state position. They see it as just role-playing. No non-state theorist uses that term, by the way, including Sarvin. What they say is role enactment in the sense which is different than role-playing. So, I have a son. When I'm with him, I am in the role of father. I'm not pretending to be a father, but I'm in that social role, and that's what Sarban used to talk about. So there's this mistaken notion, that the non-state position tries to reduce hypnotic phenomena to just role-playing, pretending, faking, not really saying you're having experiences and acting them out when you're really not. And that has never been the position of the non-state position, and certainly couldn't have been for Ted Barber, who in fact had all of these experiences. So the story is that Ted was in a debate, two Teds, Sarban and Barber, on the non-state side, and Jack Helgard and Martin Orne on the state side. And Orne was talking as evidence for a state position, start talking about hypnotic amnesia and what happens when people are instructed to forget and not remember something, and that this was part of the hypnotic state. And it came to be Ted's turn to speak, and Ted Barber. And he said, well, Martin has just been talking about what happens, people can forget things in hypnosis. Well, I could easily forget everything that Martin said, which of course brought a big laugh, and the way the story is told, that he seemed bewildered as about why people were laughing. He didn't mean that as anything funny. He was just saying, I have the ability to experience amnesia whenever I want to without being in a special state of consciousness.